One of our goals is to highlight forms of loneliness because they're all different types and they have their own impact. And there is one type that I want to bring to our attention because it can be so damaging to individuals and to their families and friends, and is referred to as moral injury. We tend to see higher levels of this within specific occupations, so military, healthcare, social work, mental health, teaching, law, that kind of thing. Anywhere where we are kind of people-facing, exposed to trauma, responsible for people's life or death or well-being, or maybe making high-stakes decisions with big consequences. The bulk of this research began with the military. However, this was prior to COVID. But before that, there was this shift in looking at the connections between moral injury and healthcare, where we thought levels might be high, but now, post-COVID, they've risen. And 78% of doctors are reporting moral distress. 51% of them are reporting moral injury. That's actually a staggering number. Okay. Now, you don't have to be a soldier or a doctor to have had an experience of this, though. A lot of the biographical pain that we have in our stories can include non-occupational moral injuries. We make mistakes, sometimes really big ones, and some of them can have permanent consequences, or they can cause suffering to others. Moral injuries tend to involve something like, I did this, and this happened to this person. I didn't do this, and then this happened. So in a way, we can feel like we've almost betrayed someone or betrayed people, often vulnerable people that maybe we're supposed to be taking care of or supporting in some way. Now, I may have done this by accident when I did it, Sometimes I did this by recklessness, or maybe I did this because my hands were completely tied in some way, And I may have been acting in a situation where there were extraordinary conditions. It may be a chaotic system or a chaotic moment, right? And maybe sometimes even in that, it drew up something ugly in me or some kind of moral weakness. And maybe this even surprised me, right? But either which way, someone or something suffered, and inside it feels like I just can't bear it. Jung called this shadow, and he said that it's only when we encounter our own shadow that we understand the scripture reference, but for the grace of God I go. All right, so you might be thinking, okay, you're talking about guilt, regret. Yes, and no. This is deeper. Usually this has a lot more kind of shame or sorrow, right? And very specific kind of questioning in here. I thought I was a good person, and now I no longer know. I'm not sure if I can ever feel good again, right? And if it's left unattended, which it often is because people don't want other people to know, it can have some pretty serious consequences, right? Sometimes there's systemic ramifications, and sometimes these are things that could raise, litigation issues, inquiries, reports, that kind of thing. And this becomes another dimension of the burden, right? So we have to kind of keep it to ourselves. So we might sort of still be out there going on about daily life, but on the inside, we're starting to feel like we no longer kind of have the right to sort of claim a moral position in society, right? And what goes on here is an individual almost kind of psychologically shuns themselves, okay? Colleagues, family members, friends, they may all start to notice a change, and they often don't understand why. This person is now starting to kind of get disconnected, hard to access, irritable, disinterested, and this is really confusing for the people around them, and it effectively leaves them very lonely. Some people say it sounds like PTSD. It's completely distinct to PTSD, although it can co-occur. Okay. Now here is what I'm going to say to you. If you've experienced something like this in your story, related to work or just life, and you have suffered this and legitimately carried the agony of something like this, it's highly unlikely you're a bad person. The bad people of the world, psychologically, are typically what I would refer to more as morally defiant. They don't acknowledge suffering they cause, and more often than not, they normalize it, or they sometimes even morally justify it as for the greater good. History is full of leaders who made decisions that caused a lot of suffering, and they agonized over this. They carried it around, sometimes their whole lives. It's also full of leaders who feel nothing. And we think that this might be actually linked to how their brains respond to power. I'll give you an example. There are case studies of work that psychoanalysts attempted to do with German perpetrators of the Holocaust, who were kind of infamously morally defiant for decades after the war. And these therapists were really committed to trying to understand, how did this happen? They were really open to hearing their perspectives. And after a period, there are repeated reports of the therapists finishing sessions with these individuals and being flooded by rage, by despair, by helplessness, to the point where one crashed a car, another became very seriously ill, and all kinds of other consequences. Quite apart from the facts, what the therapists were responding to was the absence of agony in these people. That is what disturbs us, and that is what marks the disturbed. When you work with someone who's morally injured, instead what you usually sense is something deeply moral, a sense of a common humanity, right? And the agony. And that agony doesn't come from something bad. The agony comes from the ability to love. Okay, so try to take that away. At the beginning of the Catholic Mass, during the act of penitence, believers are invited to individually acknowledge amongst fellow believers all that they have done and all that they have failed to do. This is actually how moral injuries are typically defined and described by people. Something I did, something I failed to do. And a big part of healing involves moving past the acknowledgement and into reconnection with one's community, with one's own goodness, and with a greater goodness that allows for all these painful human things. How absurd and meaningless would that ritual be if those Catholics acknowledged what they had done and what they had failed to do, and then did it again, and then did it again, and then did it again, until they became so weighted down that they walked out of the service and never came back. That's kind of what we do when we're morally injured. Instead, that ritual actually moves forward into communion, into celebration, and into going forward in peace. And just like that, life moves forward into other things, even though we carry these injuries.